Anabel Moore adjusted her blazer as she stepped into the back seat of the sleek black SUV. The soft leather seats cradled her body, but she barely noticed. Her attention, as always, was on the man in the driver's seat, Philip Carter. 50 years old, quiet, and exuding the kind of confidence that only came with experience, Philip was a man who carried his past in his eyes. A widower for the last 7 years, he never spoke much about his late wife, but Anabel had caught glimpses of sadness in his gaze when he thought no one was watching. For the past 6 months, Philip had been her personal driver, but somewhere along the line, her admiration for his professionalism had turned into something deeper. She found herself drawn to the way he handled every situation with calm assurance, the way he always anticipated her needs, and the warmth in his voice whenever he said, "Good morning, Miss Moore." Today, she felt bold. "Philip," she said, leaning forward slightly. His eyes met hers in the rear-view mirror. "Yes, Miss Moore?" She hesitated. "How long have you been driving?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Over 25 years, ma'am. Started out with cabs, then moved to private clients." She nodded, pretending to be fascinated by the information when in reality, she just wanted to keep him talking. "Do you like it?" He chuckled, a deep, rich sound that sent an unexpected thrill down her spine. "It's an honest job. Keeps me busy." "And before that," she pressed. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if debating how much to reveal. "I was in the military. Served for 15 years. That surprised her. She studied him more closely, the strong jawline, the disciplined posture, the way he never lost his composure, no matter the situation. It made sense now. "You must have seen a lot. More than I care to remember," he admitted. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with unspoken words and something else, something she wasn't sure he felt, but she knew she did. When they arrived at her office building, he stepped out and opened the door for her. As she exited, she glanced up at him, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Philip." His gaze softened. "Always, Miss Moore." She wanted to say more, wanted to ask him to call her Anabel, wanted to linger in the moment. But instead, she gave him a small smile and walked into the building, her thoughts a tangled mess of desire and uncertainty. That night, as she sat at her desk, trying to focus on her latest manuscript, she found herself writing about a woman who had fallen for a man society would call too old for her. A man with a past. A man who made her heart race. A man like Philip. And for the first time in a long time, Anabel wondered, what if she stopped hiding behind stolen glances and unspoken words? What if she took the risk? Because deep down, she already knew she wasn't just falling for him. She had already fallen. From the moment Philip Carter became her personal driver, Anabel had been captivated by his quiet confidence and effortless charm. But it wasn't just his professionalism that drew her in, it was the little things, the details that most people overlooked but she found impossible to ignore. Philip was always impeccably dressed, even for a man whose job required him to sit behind the wheel for hours. His crisp, well-pressed shirts fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and whether he wore a classic navy suit or a simple polo with tailored trousers, he carried himself with an understated elegance. His polished shoes never had a speck of dust, and his wristwatch, a simple but sophisticated timepiece, spoke of a man who valued precision and discipline. Then there was his scent. Philip's choice of cologne was subtle but intoxicating, a blend of warm cedarwood and fresh citrus that lingered in the air long after he left the car. It wasn't overpowering, but it was distinct, just like him. She had caught herself inhaling deeply more times than she cared to admit, letting the scent wrap around her like an invisible embrace. Mornings were when she noticed another side of him. On more than one occasion, she had seen him arriving at her residence in the early hours, his t-shirt clinging to his well-toned frame after what was clearly a rigorous morning workout. At 50, Philip was in remarkable shape, his dedication to fitness evident in the way he moved, with quiet strength and energy that defied his age. He didn't talk much about it unless she asked, but whenever she did, His face would light up with enthusiasm, explaining how discipline and consistency had shaped both his body and mind over the years. And then there was his love for music. Philip didn't just listen to music. He appreciated it, analyzed it, and talked about it at length with a passion that fascinated her. Jazz, classic soul, a bit of blues, his playlist was a mix of legends like Miles Davis, Nina Simone, and Frank Sinatra. He had a deep appreciation for the way a saxophone solo could tell a story, for lyrics that carried meaning, for melodies that stirred emotions. Sometimes, she would test him just to hear his thoughts. "Philip, what's your all-time favorite song?" she had once asked during a late evening ride. He had smiled, the kind of slow, thoughtful smile that made her pulse race. "That's like asking me to pick my favorite moment in life." Impossible. But if I had to choose, probably At Last by Etta James. "Romantic," she had teased. He had chuckled. "A song like that? It's not just romantic, it's timeless." And so was he. Every little thing about Philip, the way he carried himself, the way he smelled, the way he stayed fit, and the way he spoke about music as if it were poetry, had worked its way under her skin. He was unlike any man she had ever met. And that was exactly why she couldn't stop thinking about him. Philip Carter prided himself on being a man of discipline, a man who understood boundaries. But from the moment he started working for Anabel Moore, he had found himself struggling with something he never expected: attraction. She was everything a man could admire: young, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. At 25, Anabel carried herself with a confidence beyond her years. She was a business executive and a writer, a woman who thrived in boardrooms and lost herself in the world of stories. And God, was she beautiful? Philip had driven for many high-profile clients before, but Anabel had a presence that made her impossible to ignore. Her smooth, caramel-toned skin seemed to glow in the soft morning light whenever she stepped into the car. Her dark, expressive eyes held a quiet fire, a sharpness that hinted at both intelligence and curiosity. And her smile, when she allowed herself to truly smile, was a sight that stayed with him long after she was gone. But it wasn't just her looks. Philip admired her work ethic. She was up before dawn, attending meetings, closing deals, and somehow still finding time to write. He often saw her scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal between rides, her brows furrowed in deep thought. She was relentless, driven, but never arrogant. She treated everyone with kindness, including him, something that had caught him off guard early on. At first, he had told himself his growing attachment was nothing but admiration, respect for a hard-working woman. But then, the little things started to affect him. The way she smelled, always fresh, with hints of vanilla and jasmine, lingered in the car long after she left. The way her voice softened when she asked about his day, genuinely interested in his answers. The way she laughed when he spoke about his favorite songs, teasing him but never disrespecting his love for music. And then there were the moments that tested his restraint, like when she leaned forward slightly from the back seat, close enough that he could catch the warmth of her perfume. When her hand brushed his as he handed her a coffee she had forgotten in the cup holder. When she looked at him just a little too long, her gaze searching, as if she wanted to say something she never did. Philip was not a fool. He knew what this was. Anabel was young, with her whole life ahead of her. He was 50, a widower, a man who had seen life, lost love, and rebuilt himself. She deserved someone closer to her world, someone unburdened by the past. And yet, there were moments when he caught her staring at him in the rearview mirror, her eyes filled with something unspoken. Moments when her voice held a softness that made his chest tighten. Moments when he wondered, what if? But he couldn't afford to think that way. She was his boss. She was young. And no matter how much his heart betrayed him, he had spent a lifetime mastering control. Or so he thought. Philip had convinced himself that he was in control. That whatever he felt for Anabel was just admiration, something fleeting that would pass with time. But time had only made things worse. Every day, she became harder to resist. It wasn't just her beauty, though God knew she was stunning. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes, the way she treated everyone with a rare mix of confidence and kindness. She had a way of making people feel seen, valued. Even him. Especially him. That was dangerous. Because as much as he tried to keep a professional distance, Anabel seemed determined to break through his walls. Like this evening, when she had asked him to take a detour on the way home. "Philip," she said from the back seat, her voice smooth and relaxed. "Do you mind if we stop by the park?" He glanced at her in the mirror. "The park." She smiled, tilting her head. "Yes. The one near the waterfront. I just need some fresh air before going home." Philip hesitated. It was late, and he usually preferred to take her straight home after work. But the way she was looking at him, soft, expectant, made it impossible to say no. "Of course, Miss Moore," he said, keeping his voice even. "Anabel," she corrected gently. "You've worked for me for 6 months now. I think it's time you called me by my name." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That wouldn't be appropriate." She chuckled. "Why not?" "Because you're my boss. Because I already think about you more than I should. Because I can't afford to let this go any further." "But instead," he said, "it's just professional courtesy." Anabel leaned forward slightly, close enough that he could catch the soft scent of vanilla and jasmine. "And what if I don't want professional courtesy?" she asked, her voice quiet. Philip's heart did something it hadn't done in years. It stuttered. He didn't answer because he didn't trust himself to. A few minutes later, he pulled up by the park. The night air was crisp, and the city lights reflected off the water in the distance. Anabel stepped out of the car and stretched, taking a deep breath. "Come with me," she said suddenly. Philip blinked. "What?" She turned to face him fully. "Walk with me." He hesitated. "Anabel, please." The way she said it, soft, almost vulnerable, made him sigh. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the car and fell into step beside her. They walked in silence at first, the sound of the distant waves filling the space between them. Anabel had her hands in her coat pockets, her gaze fixed ahead. "You always do that," she said after a moment. "Do what?" "Hold yourself back." Philip glanced at her. "I don't." "Yes, you do." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I see it. You're always so careful with me, so controlled. That's my job." Her eyes searched his face. "And is that all this is to you? A job?" Philip felt the ground shift beneath him. He should have said yes. He should have kept his walls up. But standing here, under the moonlight, with Anabel looking at him like that, he couldn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something fragile but undeniable. Then Anabel took a step closer. Philip's breath caught. She was too close. Too young. Too beautiful. Too dangerous. But when she looked up at him, her dark eyes full of quiet longing, he realized something. He wasn't just fighting his feelings anymore. He was losing. Philip had spent most of his life mastering restraint. In the military, it had been drilled into him: discipline, composure, control. Even after leaving the service, those principles had shaped his life. But standing here, with Anabel looking up at him with those dark, searching eyes, he felt all of that slipping through his fingers. He needed to step back. He needed to say something, anything, to remind them both of the lines that shouldn't be crossed. But then she did something that completely unraveled him. She reached out and touched his hand. It was the lightest touch, just her fingers brushing against his, but Philip felt it like a jolt of electricity straight to his chest. "Anabel," his voice was low, rough. A warning. She didn't move away. If anything, she took another small step closer. "You feel it too, don't you?" Philip closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling sharply. Yes. He felt it. He had been feeling it for months. But that didn't mean he could act on it. "This isn't a good idea," he murmured, forcing himself to step back, breaking the contact. Her face flickered with something: hurt, frustration, but she quickly masked it with a small, knowing smile. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Pull away." She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "You pretend like you don't want this, but I see it, Philip. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. Philip exhaled, running a hand over his face. You're young, Anabel. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't say it, she interrupted, shaking her head. Don't say you're too old for me. It's the truth. She took a step closer again, undeterred. It's an excuse. Philip let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Is it? Yes. Her voice softened. Because if age was really the problem, you wouldn't be looking at me like you are right now. Damn it. She was right. He was looking at her. Really looking at her. And now that the words were out in the open, now that there was no more pretending, Philip felt his resolve slipping even further. But he wasn't just worried about the age difference. It was more than that. You're my boss, he reminded her, as much for himself as for her. She let out a soft laugh. I don't care. You should. I don't, she insisted, stepping even closer, so close now that he could see the faint freckles dusting her nose. I've been trying to fight this for months, Philip. But I can't anymore. And I don't think you can either. Philip swallowed hard. He could smell the soft traces of her perfume, vanilla and jasmine. She was so close, her lips slightly parted, her gaze locked onto his. If he kissed her now, there would be no turning back. But before he could do anything, before he could make the biggest mistake of his career or the best decision of his life, his phone buzzed. The sound was sharp, cutting through the moment like a blade. Philip pulled back instantly, reaching for his phone as if it were a lifeline. Anabel let out a small sigh, watching him with unreadable eyes. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his sister. I have to take this, he said, voice strained. She nodded slowly, but the disappointment was there, plain as day. Philip turned away, pressing the phone to his ear. As he spoke, he felt the weight of her gaze on his back. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure if he had just made the right choice, or the biggest mistake of his life. The moment lingered in Anabel's mind for days. The way Philip had looked at her in the park, the way his breath had hitched when she touched him, she knew he wanted her. He was just too disciplined, too controlled, too stubborn to admit it. But she wasn't going to let him run forever. So, she waited. She gave him space, acting as if nothing had happened. But she knew that wasn't true. Because the way Philip looked at her now, it had changed. There was tension between them, thick, charged. She felt it when he held the car door open for her, his fingers tightening just slightly when she brushed past him. She saw it when their eyes met in the rearview mirror, and he quickly looked away. She heard it in his voice, how careful he was now when he spoke to her, as if trying to keep himself in check. It was only a matter of time before he cracked. And she knew exactly how to make that happen. It was a rainy evening. The city streets were slick with water, the streetlights casting golden reflections against the pavement. Anabel had just finished a long dinner meeting, and Philip was waiting for her outside the restaurant. As she slid into the back seat, she let out a soft sigh, rubbing her temple. Tired, he asked, his voice steady as always. She nodded. Exhausted. It's been a long day. Philip didn't respond, but she felt it, the way his gaze lingered on her in the mirror, just for a second longer than usual. She had him. As they drove, she decided to push a little further. It's still early, she murmured. And I don't feel like going home just yet. Philip's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Where do you want to go? She smiled to herself. Somewhere quiet. He didn't ask any more questions, just nodded and drove. Minutes later, he pulled into a secluded overlook that gave a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The rain had eased to a soft drizzle, the streetlights shimmering against the wet pavement. Philip turned off the engine, his jaw tight. Is this quiet enough? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached forward, trailing her fingers along his shoulder, slow, teasing. He stiffened instantly. Anabel. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his neck. Tell me to stop. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, finally, he exhaled. You know I can't do that. That was all the invitation she needed. Anabel reached for him, her fingers sliding against his cheek, turning his face toward hers. He resisted at first, just for a second, before something inside him broke. And then he was kissing her. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It was deep, urgent, months of unspoken desire finally spilling over. Philip's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in his salt and pepper hair. She had imagined this moment so many times, but nothing compared to the reality of it. The heat of his body, the strength in his arms, the way he kissed like a man who had held back for too long. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "This is a mistake," he whispered. Anabel smiled. "Then why does it feel so right?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the way he pulled her back into another kiss told her everything she needed to know. Philip Carter had finally stopped running. Philip had spent months trying to resist her, trying to convince himself that they couldn't happen. But as he held Anabel in his arms, feeling the warmth of her body against his, he knew he had already lost that battle. Her lips were soft, eager, teasing him with just enough pressure to drive him insane. Her hands roamed up his chest, tracing the hard lines beneath his shirt, as if she had been dying to touch him for as long as he had been dying to touch her. This wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something dangerous, something he wasn't sure he could ever walk away from now. He pulled back slightly, his breathing uneven. "Anabel." She gazed up at him, her dark eyes full of heat and something else, something tender. "Don't push me away this time," she whispered. Philip swallowed hard. He should. He should tell her that this was wrong, that she deserved someone younger, someone who wasn't carrying the weight of a past life. But when she pressed her lips against his again, all his reasons melted into nothing. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing along her cheek. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he murmured against her lips. She smiled. "Oh, I do." He let out a soft, deep chuckle, shaking his head. "Your trouble. And you love it," she teased. God help him, he did. But even in the haze of desire, Philip knew they couldn't stay in this moment forever. They were still in his car, parked at a secluded overlook, the city lights twinkling in the distance. This wasn't how he wanted their first real moment together to be, not rushed, not hidden. With a deep breath, he pulled away slightly, his hand still resting against her waist. "We should get you home," he said, his voice hoarse. She searched his face. "And after that?" Philip hesitated. "We take this slow." Her lips curled into a knowing smile. "You're scared." "I'm cautious," he corrected. "You're my boss, Anabel. This changes everything." She traced a finger along his jawline. "It already has." Philip exhaled. He knew she was right. There was no going back now. But if they were going to do this, they were going to do it right. "I'll take you home," he said again, softer this time. "And if you still want this tomorrow," he reached up, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Then we talk." She bit her lip, then nodded. "Okay. Tomorrow." Philip started the car, but as they drove, he could still taste her on his lips, still feel the warmth of her against him. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. He was looking forward to it. The air between them had been charged ever since that night in the car. Every glance, every touch, every stolen moment had only made the tension worse. And when Philip arrived at Anabel's apartment that evening, he knew there would be no more holding back. She had invited him over under the pretense of talking. But the moment she opened the door, Philip knew that words were the last thing on either of their minds. Anabel stood before him barefoot, wearing a simple silk robe that barely grazed her thighs. Her hair was loose, cascading down her shoulders in soft waves. But it was her eyes that undid him, the way they smoldered with quiet intent, filled with the same hunger he had been trying to deny for months. Philip stepped inside, and before he could say a word, she reached for him, pulling him into a kiss that shattered his last ounce of restraint. He groaned against her lips, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her flesh against him. She was soft, warm, intoxicating. The scent of vanilla and jasmine surrounded him, and he wanted to drown in it. "Philip," she whispered, her fingers tracing the muscles beneath his shirt. That was all it took. With a low growl, he lifted her effortlessly into his arms, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her toward the living room. The city lights spilled through the large windows, casting a golden glow over her skin. He sat on the couch with her straddling him, his hands roaming over her curves, learning every inch of her. She gasped as his lips found the sensitive spot along her neck, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "I've wanted this for so long," she breathed. Philip pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You have no idea," he murmured, before capturing her lips in another deep, searing kiss. There was no hesitation now. No doubt. Just them. His hands moved to untie the silk belt of her robe, and as the fabric slipped from her shoulders, he took a moment to admire her. Every curve, every inch of flawless skin, the way her chest rose and fell with anticipation. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough with desire. Anabel smiled, leaning down so that her lips barely brushed his. "Then show me," she whispered. And he did. That night, Philip Carter let go of every reason he had for resisting her. He loved her without hesitation, without restraint. And when they finally lay tangled together, bodies still warm, breaths still uneven, Philip knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. Philip lay on his back, staring at the ceiling as Anabel curled against him, her head resting on his chest. His fingers traced slow, lazy circles on her bare shoulder, his mind still trying to process what had just happened between them. He had spent months convincing himself that this was a line he could never cross. And yet, here he was, tangled in her sheets, his body still thrumming with the aftershocks of their passion. Anabel sighed contentedly, shifting slightly so she could look up at him. "You're thinking too much," she murmured, her fingers skimming over his jawline. Philip chuckled, the deep sound rumbling in his chest. "Old habit," she smiled, pressing a soft kiss against his shoulder. "Do you regret it?" His hand tightened around her waist instinctively, pulling her closer. "No," he said firmly, "but I am trying to figure out where we go from here." Anabel propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him. "We don't overthink it," she said simply. "We just be." Philip reached up, brushing a curl from her face. "You make it sound easy." "Because it is." She leaned down, pressing her lips against his in a slow, teasing kiss. "Unless you want to make it complicated." Philip groaned softly, flipping them over so that he was hovering above her, his strong hands braced on either side of her head. "You really are trouble," he murmured against her lips.
She grinned.
"And you really love it." He didn't deny it. Instead, he kissed her again, his resolve crumbling all over again. Because no matter how much he tried to fight it, one truth remained. Anabel Moore was his greatest temptation. And he wasn't sure he ever wanted to resist her again. The scent of sizzling garlic and butter filled Anabel's apartment, mingling with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. She stood barefoot in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed, watching Philip move with effortless precision as he prepared their dinner. She had never imagined seeing him like this, his usual crisp shirts and tailored trousers replaced by a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans. The sleeves stretched over his muscular arms, and a clean kitchen towel was slung over his shoulder as he stirred something in the pan. "You never told me you could cook," she mused, stepping closer. Philip glanced over his shoulder, a small smirk playing at his lips. "There's a lot you don't know about me." She leaned against the counter, watching as he plated the food, perfectly seared salmon, roasted vegetables, and a creamy sauce that smelled divine. "And when exactly were you planning to share these hidden talents?" He chuckled, setting the plate down before turning to her, wiping his hands on the towel. "I figured tonight was as good a time as any." Anabel arched a brow. "So, let me get this straight. You drive me around, take care of me, and now you're cooking for me too?" She tilted her head playfully. "You sure you weren't meant to be my husband instead of my driver?" Philip stilled for a fraction of a second, something unreadable flashing in his eyes before he let out a deep laugh. "Careful, Anabel. Keep talking like that, and I just might never leave." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing over the towel still in his hand. Maybe I don't want you to. The air between them shifted instantly. Philip's eyes darkened, his gaze flickering to her lips before settling back on her face. He reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering just a little too long. "Anabel," he said softly, his voice low and thick with something she couldn't quite name. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her palms. "Yes, Philip." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if trying to resist this. But it was too late for that. With one swift motion, she grabbed the towel from his shoulder and tossed it aside before wrapping her arms around his neck. "You made me dinner," she murmured, tilting her head up. "I think that deserves a reward." Philip's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" She stood on her toes, closing the distance between them until their lips were just a breath apart. "This." And then she kissed him. Soft at first, teasing, tasting. But Philip was never a man to do things halfway. He groaned against her mouth, his hands sliding to her waist as he pulled her flesh against him. The kitchen counter dug into her back as he deepened the kiss, his fingers slipping beneath the hem of her oversized shirt, grazing the bare skin of her lower back. The world outside faded. There was no work, no age gap, no rules. Just them, lost in the heat of the moment, the scent of good food and something even more intoxicating filling the space between them. When they finally pulled apart, Anabel's breath was uneven, her fingers still tangled in his hair. Philip pressed his forehead against hers, chuckling softly. "You're going to be the death of me." She grinned, sliding her hands down his chest. "Then I guess I should keep you well fed." He shook his head, laughing as he kissed her again, slow and deep, savoring every second. Dinner could wait. Right now, she was all he wanted to taste. The city skyline shimmered outside Anabel's bedroom window, casting a soft glow over the room. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with a longing that had been building for months. Tonight, there were no more hesitations. No more restraint. Philip stood before her, his dark eyes locked onto hers as if silently asking for permission one last time. Anabel didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. "You don't have to hold back anymore," she whispered. Philip exhaled sharply, his resolve crumbling as he cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head back. "You don't know what you're asking for," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, pressing her body against his. "Then show me." That was all he needed. His lips crashed against hers, deep and unrelenting. She melted into him, her fingers tangling in his salt and pepper hair as he lifted her effortlessly into his arms. She gasped as her back met the cool sheets, but the warmth of his body soon erased the chill. Philip's touch was slow, reverent, fingers tracing every inch of her skin, as if memorizing her. He kissed along her jaw, down the delicate curve of her neck, his breath warm against her collarbone. Anabel arched beneath him, her body aching for more. "Philip," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. He pulled back slightly, his gaze roaming over her with a mix of admiration and desire. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his hands sliding down her sides, igniting every nerve in her body. She reached for him, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. Their bodies moved in perfect rhythm, each touch, each kiss deepening the connection between them. It wasn't just passion, it was something more, something raw and unspoken. Time seemed to stand still as they lost themselves in each other. Every touch was a promise, every whisper a confession. And when they finally lay tangled together, their breaths still uneven, Philip pulled her into his arms, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. "I don't think I can ever let you go," he admitted softly. Anabel smiled against his chest, tracing lazy patterns over his skin. "Then don't." Philip tightened his hold on her, as if anchoring himself to this moment. Because now there was no turning back. And neither of them wanted to. The office was quiet, the usual hum of ringing phones and distant chatter replaced by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Outside the glass windows, the city stretched into the night, neon lights flickering against the dark sky. Anabel stood by her desk, her breath coming fast, her pulse thrumming in anticipation. Philip stood just inches away, his gaze locked onto hers, dark, intense, filled with the same hunger she had felt all day. It had started with stolen glances, a lingering touch when he handed her a file, the accidental brush of his fingers against hers when he adjusted the seatbelt in the car earlier. By the time they were alone in her office, the tension had become unbearable. "I should go," Philip said, his voice low, rough. Anabel took a step closer, placing a hand against his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "Do you want to?" His jaw clenched. "You know the answer to that." She reached up, tracing her fingers along his jawline, tilting his face toward hers. "Then stay." That was all it took. Philip closed the distance between them in one swift motion, his lips crashing against hers, urgent and unrelenting. Anabel moaned against his mouth as he pressed her back against the desk, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer. The air around them grew thick with desire. Paper scattered to the floor as Philip lifted her onto the desk, his fingers skimming beneath the hem of her blouse, exploring, teasing. Her skin burned beneath his touch, her body arching into him as he deepened the kiss. "You drive me crazy," he murmured against her lips, his voice laced with desire. Anabel let out a soft laugh, breathless. "Then stop fighting it." Philip groaned, his restraint snapping as he pulled her flesh against him. His hands roamed her body with practiced precision, every touch, every kiss sending waves of heat coursing through her veins. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer, needing more, needing him. The sleek wood of the desk was cool against her back as Philip leaned over her, his lips tracing a slow, burning path down her neck, over her collarbone. Every kiss, every touch was deliberate, sending shivers down her spine. "Philip," she whispered, her voice filled with need. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own filled with something deeper than just desire. "Tell me this isn't a mistake." Anabel reached up, cupping his face in her hands, her gaze unwavering. "The only mistake would be pretending this doesn't mean something." Something flickered in his expression. Something raw, something real. And then, without another word, he claimed her again, their bodies moving in perfect, unrestrained harmony. Passion and control warred between them, the office walls bearing witness to the undeniable pull that had drawn them together from the start. The city continued on outside, unaware of the storm unfolding within these four walls. And when it was over, when they lay breathless and tangled together in the dim light of the office, Philip brushed a kiss against her forehead, his fingers trailing down her arm. "This is dangerous," he murmured. Anabel smiled, tracing circles against his chest. "So is driving too fast. But sometimes, it's worth the risk." Philip exhaled, pulling her close once more. And for the first time, he was ready to risk it all. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the golden glow of the setting sun painting the waves in hues of amber and blue. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine, rustling Anabel's hair as she stood barefoot in the sand, her white dress billowing around her legs. Behind her, she felt his presence before he even touched her. Philip, the man who had once been just her driver, the man who had become so much more. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her gently against his chest. She sighed, leaning into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against her back. His lips brushed against her ear, sending a delicious shiver down her spine. "You're thinking," he murmured, his voice rich, deep, intoxicating. Anabel smiled, tilting her head slightly. "I'm just taking it all in." Philip's grip tightened around her, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "Regrets?" She turned in his arms, her dark eyes locking onto his. Not a single one. His lips curled into that slow, devastating smile that always made her heart stutter. "Good." And then, without warning, he lifted her into his arms, making her squeal in surprise. "Philip," she laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. He carried her effortlessly toward the private cabana nestled among the palm trees, the the soft glow of candles casting flickering shadows against the white curtains billowing in the evening breeze. Inside, a bed draped in silk sheets awaited them, surrounded by petals and the soft hum of music playing in the background. "You planned all this?" she whispered, touched beyond words. Philip set her down gently, his hands never leaving her body. "I wanted tonight to be unforgettable." Her fingers traced his jaw, her eyes filled with emotion. "Every night with you is." Philip exhaled, cupping her face as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. "Anabel, I love you." Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she smiled, placing her hand over his heart. "I love you too." That was all he needed. His lips claimed hers in a slow, soul-stealing kiss, one that spoke of every whispered promise, every stolen moment, every battle fought and won for this love. They sank into the soft sheets together, the world outside forgotten. Every touch was unhurried, every kiss lingering, as if they had all the time in the world. The heat between them built slowly, teasing, exploring, savoring. There was no rush, no urgency, only the deep, aching need to love and be loved. Philip worshipped her with every touch, every whispered word against her skin. And Anabel gave herself to him completely, matching his passion with her own, losing herself in the man who had become her everything. As they moved together, lost in the rhythm of love, Anabel knew this was forever. And nothing, not time, not distance, not the past, could ever change that.